I apologize in advance. My pronunciations may be inconsistent or incorrect. Um, but I'm going to talk about the universal circulus. It gets mentioned in the humanosphere, and Déjacque kind of puts a pin in it, a mental, makes sort of a mental note, but it's a note in the text saying like, "Oh, I'm going to come back to this at some point in the future," and he does. At the close of 1858, he publishes the Universal Circulus in two parts in Les Libertaires, and the Universal Circulus contains Déjacque's discussion of, quote, the philosophy of the ideas put forward in the humanosphere. And as part of that discussion, Déjacque expresses cosmological positions and suggests that one may review claims from historically non scientific domains of discourse, such as religion and morality, given findings from the sciences. Notably, he does not address considerations associated with Hume's is ought problem as it might pertain to such a project, but contemporary scientific findings support and qualify Déjacque's claims in the Universal Circulus. Um, in his summary of the Universal Circulus, Déjacque denies the existence of three conceptually related things. One, the soul, the absolute of the human individuality, one and indivisible, eternally finished form. That's one thing that he's denying. More generally, two, the absolute soul of the infinite. And most generally, three, the absolute, whose non existence, he asserts, logically precludes the existence of the other absolutes listed. Déjacque focuses readers' attention on an absolute declared non existent in an attempt to give a logical foundation to a rhetorical position akin to doctrines of an Atman. And to explore this, I wish to confirm Déjacque's conception of the absolute, and because Déjacque does not define this term explicitly, I appealed to context. Déjacque expresses much of the universal circulus in sets of idiosyncratic quasi-synonyms, for example, motion and progress, which lends the piece to close reading. According to translator Sean P. Wilbur, Déjacque uses terms, quote, suggestively, not according to the established uses of the writers or schools they were drawn from, end quote. Déjacque summarizes his piece with those three negations before asserting the identity of all as, quote, matter. He would be more descriptive and self consistent if he asserted the identity of all as, quote, animated, that is living, and passional, that is feeling, substance, end quote, which he distinguishes in context from a contradictory dyad of matter and mind. He indicates that what we call matter is raw mind or spirit, and what we call mind or spirit is wrought matter. Déjacque's characterization of the hard problem seems more nuanced than a general panpsychism and accords with historically posterior positions that emphasize degrees of organization and emergence in constituents of a noosphere. His positions would seem to allow for the comparison of such constituents on a continuum of increasing awareness or intelligence. He describes an ongoing and unbounded movement, constantly transforming everlasting substance, such that movement and substance share an identity in which they're mutually interdependent. Déjacque suggests that distinguishing matter from the transformation of this unity of movement and substance would be as misleading as distinguishing the transformation of the unity of movement and substance from mind or spirit. He indicates that intelligent or inspired flux exists or is existence, such that it has a capacity for betterment of beings, a perpetual upward movement. Such an upward movement may transpire in the absence of effort, though Déjacque indicates that a being sufficiently, quote, perfected, one of his quasi synonyms for developed or evolved, aspires interminably toward its further perfection, that is, development in proportion to increases in same. Déjacque posits that because change will never stop and perfection's always relative, there is no condition without, quote, perfectibility. Quote, there is and can be no absolute except perfectibility, end quote. Its context makes clear that perfectibility is not the absolute Déjacque denies elsewhere in the text, but rather that which is incompatible with that denied absolute. Déjacque declares that in addition to interminable development, movement precludes the existence of the absolute. Quote, with movement, the absolute cannot exist, end quote. Déjacque argues that motion ceaselessly transforms all beings at all scales, including those of the human individual and species, and furthermore that such ongoing transformation occurs across the bounds of beings, such that entities live only on the condition of taking part in the lives of others. Déjacque thus articulates assumptions of impermanence and dependent origination, consistent with the concept of Anatman. The idea of an exponentially increasing and inexhaustible tendency toward improvement provides a counterpoint to notions of an unchanging thing in itself, not subject to, quote, the same laws of decomposition as the body, end quote, that is, exempt from an arrow of entropy. An unchanging, independent, and perhaps perfect or teleologically complete entity might be considered atemporal or non physical, something other than animated and passional substance, perhaps the absolute whose existence Déjacque denies. Déjacque identifies his negated absolute with a negated God, despite his complaints regarding the vagueness of the later term as conventionally used, the latter term as conventionally used. Déjacque discloses that he seeks to counter religion's historical role in producing or reproducing authoritarian social organization, such that conditions sufficient for a more perfect, quote, fraternal communion of humans may develop. Déjacque implies that one may regard authoritarian social dynamics as species level developmental pathology, humanity's maturation arrested at a pre solidarity phase. Normative participation in coercive dynamics, especially those that Déjacque recognizes in traditional religious forms, may contribute to developmental pathology in humanity as a species and in its constituent organisms. In this context, Déjacque does not seem to note an explicit relation between coercion of humans and adverse consequences regarding development in or of other species. Déjacque calls for the sciences to reshape normative aspirations associated with intuitions that he identifies at the roots of religion. He characterizes such intuitions as humanity's sense of, quote, immortality in mortals, end quote, and suggests that science may influence the forms of their expression such that as knowledge improves, so might such forms. For example, the contemporary standard model of particle physics embeds implications of special relativity in quantum field theory. Such knowledge and subsequent scientific findings more generally might shape the religious forms that succeed the targets of Déjacque's critique. Similarly, such scientific findings may inform readings of Déjacque's claims themselves. Déjacque suggests that successors to prior religious norms and knowledge may be found in, quote, the science of man and of humanity and of universality, end quote. He connects concepts of the social sciences to those of the sciences more generally, and echoing Plato, relates notions of the biological and the physical in recognizing movement as a condition of life. In describing his cosmology, Déjacque seems to attempt deriving a conclusion via the principle of non-contradiction, namely that the world, quote, cannot be a mutable thing and an immutable one, movement excluding immobility and vice versa, but must be, on the contrary, an infinite unity of always mutable and always mobile substance, which implies perfectibility, end quote. Contemporary scientific paradigms, those that Déjacque charges with informing religious innovation, may challenge elements of his conclusion, leaving merits of the argument whereby he arrives at that conclusion aside. Such contemporary paradigms decouple conceptions of mobility and mutability in ways that offer paths toward integration between Parmenidean and Heraclitean worldviews. Déjacque's philosophical positions clearly echo those of Heraclitus in his discussion of non duality and perfectibility. In Nietzsche's treatment of pre-Platonic philosophers, he indicates that Heraclitus has a proto-Hellenistic conception of non-opposition between matter and, quote, the non-material, or spirit, such that flux proceeds without end in a rejection of any teleological view of the world. Heraclitus identifies the cosmos as living fire, quote, living fire, and with the anthropomorphic deity Aeon, whom Heraclitus characterizes as a playing child. One might map Aeon or living fire to Déjacque's animated and passional substance. Multiple meanings associated with Aeon, for example, life, time, etc., make interpretation of its intended usage in Heraclitus challenging. Déjacque posits an inseparability of movement and substance that's consistent with the notion of the substance as animated. Such a conflation of movement and substance may be expressed in the formalism of Newtonian physics as linear or translational momentum, given the equation momentum equals velocity scaled by mass, or in terms of movement and substance, movement's direction scaled by movement speed, scaled by amount of moving substance as measured in kilograms or pounds. Alternately, formal definitions of angular momentum that assume rotational motion first appear in the literature no later than 1858, the same year in which Déjacque published the Universal Circulus. Although Déjacque makes special mention of turning and circular revolution, given the broad, unqualified character of his claims regarding inseparable movement and substance, its expression in terms of momentum likely pertains to both translational and angular subtypes. Perhaps exemplifying perfectibility, 20th century concepts of momentum updated their 19th century predecessors. Einstein's special relativity theory extends intuitive motion and substance notions of momentum by permitting expressions of velocity, or speed and direction of motion, with regard to an inertial frame of reference. That is, the paradigm does not admit absolute rest, and it further extends the concept of momentum by permitting mass or substance to be expressed in terms of energy, because conversion between such units may be computed with known factors. For example, E equals mc squared. In quantum mechanics, momentum gets further generalized such that it admits cases of null rest mass, that is, cases in which there is no measurable amount of substance when assuming no measurable amount of motion, as in cases of photon momentum, such that Déjacque's unity of movement and substance may be made legible as kinetic energy and made computable as a function of wave frequency, as in cases of photon momentum or matter waves. Momentum in quantum mechanics may map to the excitation or energy level of a field in quantum field theory, which combines special relativity theory and quantum mechanics. With subsequent findings and innovation in physical modeling, scientific concepts of momentum and their relationships to Déjacque's claims may continue to unfurl. If Déjacque's claim of ubiquitous, always mobile substance is read through the assumption that motion would require at least one thing at two different positions and times, quantum indeterminacy with regard to position may contradict the claim. In a prevalent interpretation of quantum mechanics, assuming an atomic object to speak of, its position at any given time is not uniquely determined, and so one cannot properly that it goes from one place to another because, colloquially speaking, it's not in only one place to start with and can't be in only one place to end with. However, determination of atomic object unique position is not required to measure the average translational kinetic energy of a set of atomic objects, that is, the temperature of a body or system, a quantity proportional to atomic object momenta. In this way, a change in scale from the quantum to that of atomic aggregations in bodies may permit one to observe or compute thermodynamic phenomena such that measurement indicates that energy momentum tends to cross system boundaries in accord with certain constraints. In this sense of motion as an expression of conservation laws, findings from the physical sciences support Déjacque's claim. A system at two different temperatures on two different measuring occasions, whose amount of matter remains constant, qualifies as evidence of mobility as per its proportional transfer of work and heat with its surroundings. Similarly, Déjacque might support his claim of ubiquitous, always mobile substance in thermodynamic terms with the impossibility of absolute zero, a phenomenon implied by indeterminism of momentum at quantum scale and corresponding zero-point energy. Déjacque yokes his claim of ubiquitous, always mutable substance to his claim that such substance is always moving, declaring, quote, everything that is mobile is mutable, and everything that is mutable is mobile, end quote. While it is possible to read him as indicating, like so many other philosophers, an equivalence relation between motion and change, taking Déjacque at his word suggests a claim regarding not first order flux, that is, his claim is not just about change as motion or change as variation in energy momentum distribution, but rather second order flux. That is, his claim is about the modification of first order motion or modification of variation in energy momentum distribution. For example, a system may be measured at two different temperatures on two different measuring occasions, an instance of first order flux. And if someone could alter the temperatures after they had been measured, that would be an example of second order flux, changing the change. Regarding all of spacetime as equally real does not seem to permit second order flux, though it does seem to permit first order flux. It would not seem to permit changing the apparent future, though it does seem to permit affecting it. Computable causal relations between events consistent with an absence of second order flux imply that energy momentum distribution or distributions may be as fixed in the apparent past as in the apparent future. Einstein's reported belief that special relativity theory was Parmenidean may assist in cultivating intuitions regarding the coexistence of the apparent past and future. For example, when Parmenides writes of an entity whose name has been translated as what is or the one, he indicates that it, quote, neither was at any time nor will be, since it is now, all at once, a single whole. His use of is contrasts with the spirit of his message, such that we must suppose that the point of his remark is to say that a language which employs tenses cannot properly describe the colloquially all at once existence of what is, because it involves no temporal succession of earlier and later. With such framing, one may conceive of the physical universe as ungenerated, unchanging, and as that from which ideas of change and creativity, perhaps even in Whitehead's sense of the term, may be abstracted. In accord with special relativity theory, one may conceive of event sets that correspond to movement, for example, point particle motion, as containing events that coexist non simultaneously. A worldview represented by Heraclitus is encompassed by one represented by Parmenides. Déjacque's denial of an unchanging independent absolute might be considered a denial of that which is not animated and passional substance. However, a thing whose properties include independence and changelessness might also contain or be constituted by the physical in its historical entirety, all first order flux instantiated as animated and passional substance, and no second order flux. Déjacque indicates that distinguishing matter from transformation would be as misleading as distinguishing transformation from mind or spirit. This suggests that the intuitive sense of immortality in mortals that Déjacque ascribes to humanity and identifies at the root of human religious behavior may be, as a mental or spiritual phenomenon, inseparable from transformation, perhaps inseparable from energy momentum as distributed in apparent past and apparent future. Déjacque recognizes apparently instinctual, that is, ineradicable human intuitions of immortality, yet he denies the existence of, quote, the absolute of the human individuality, one and indivisible, eternally finished form, end quote. If that denial constitutes a denial of one's immutable life destiny, in the sense of aeon as the span of a human life, or a person's life as a complete or completed whole, one may translate that into the language of special relativity theory as a denial of the region that encompasses the events of one's path through spacetime, one's world tube. Déjacque may have attempted to justify such a denial in two ways. Déjacque indicates that ongoing transformation occurs across the bounds of beings, such that entities live, quote, only on the condition of taking part in the lives of others, end quote. For each world tube that one might propose, Déjacque implies a set of world tubes whose intersections with the proposed world tube correspond to life giving or life sustaining interactions. Consequently, Déjacque's denial of a human individual's indivisible, eternally finished form could resemble a line of argument that posits an Atman as implicit in dependent origination, with world tube intersection interpreted as counter evidence to the claim of individuality. However, if Déjacque's denial of one's eternal human absolute or soul hinges upon notions of impermanence that overstep into physical presentism, that is, the idea that now is the only thing that exists or is more real than other times, such physical presentism would seem to contradict a well documented implication of the relativity of simultaneity. The existence of a physical event does not depend on an observer's reference frame. Experimental vindication of special relativity theory bolstered enthusiasm for philosophical positions associated with logical positivism. In the context of Einstein's era, Déjacque's philosophical positions seem more consistent with those of Einstein's reputed antagonist, Henri Bergson. Bergson was born in Paris about 5 years before Déjacque died there in 1864. And although a preliminary review of the literature indicates no evidence of a direct line of intellectual inheritance from Déjacque to Bergson, it may be a historical coincidence worth noting, given the themes of the Universal Circulus, that a 1909 publication, The Equinox, had a masthead which read, "The Method of Science, the Aim of a Religion." Its publisher had previously associated with Henri Bergson's sister, Moina, through their contemporaneous membership in the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. In 1913, Henri Bergson, was elected as president of the British Society of Psychical Research, an organization dedicated to impartial investigation of so-called paranormal phenomena, whose work at times included debunking claims in the course of exploring them. In 1922, Bergson and Einstein met publicly as Einstein's philosophical break with logical positivism was underway. They spoke at a gathering of Société Française de Philosophie in Paris. Bergson indicated that he accepted special relativity theory as a physical theory, yet he rejected Einstein's position regarding the social role of philosophy in relation to that of science. Bergson's position regarding the relation between philosophy and science, as articulated in Creative Evolution, casts philosophy as, quote, the study of becoming in general, true evolutionism, and consequently the true continuation of science, provided that we understand by this word, science, a set of truths either experienced or demonstrated, end quote, such that experienced truths may include, quote, the turning of the mind homeward, the coincidence of human consciousness with the living principle whence it emanates, a contact with the creative effort, end quote. Déjacque expresses parallel sentiments with regard to religion, not quote unquote philosophy, in his earlier essay on religion from 1861, 3 years following the publication of the Universal Circulus. I know I phrased that in a way that might be confusing. So, Humanisphere, Circulus, Religion Essay, long gap, Bergson. Uh, Déjacque indicates in this essay that religion ought be, quote, the evolving synthesis of the contemporary truths, perpetual observation and unification, the progressive organization of all the recognized sciences, the principle and consecration of every movement in humanity and universality, end quote. Bergson's advocacy regarding philosophical truths as inclusive of the experiential coincidence of human consciousness with the living principle whence it emanates suggests commonality between philosophical and religious domains so described. In this sense, Déjacque and Bergson indicate ideals that share a common spirit. Bergson's conception of philosophical truth as inclusive of one's experiential coincidence of human consciousness with the living principle whence it emanates, echoes a Heraclitean characterization of wisdom as congruence, if not unification or equivalence, between one's intuitive intelligence and that of the substance of the world at play. As such philosophical truth or wisdom pertains to the roots of human religious need that Déjacque discusses, that is, to intuitions of immortality and mortals, Déjacque embeds within his cosmology of momentum calls for the sciences to inform the reshaping of normative aspirations associated with that truth or wisdom so as to remove authoritarian impediments to human solidarity. Within a few decades of the deaths of Bergson and Einstein, almost 100 years after Déjacque died, theorists and activists began to recognize Déjacque as a quote, vital forerunner for their perspectives, end quote, with differing schools of thought each interpreting him as their own, such that it may be, quote, grossly anachronistic to see him strictly as an anarchist or a proponent of a libertarian socialism, end quote. It may be similarly anachronistic and in other ways inaccurate to characterize Déjacque as a Bergsonian or Thelemite. Further investigation, perhaps in the vein of the work of Jim Urpeth or Eric Halagalis, may reveal to what extent such perspectives dovetail with positions articulated in the Universal Circulus and in Déjacque's work more generally.